Okay, it's actually until 7:20, we have invited talk. So I'm so honored to introduce the invited talker, Dorothy Ann. Actually, she's from the Rutgers University, and as far as I know, yeah, because we have a chance to meet just before this presentation, but it was very small talk, but I was very impressive because when she was a graduate student, she had a chance to go into the sign language. So actually she received her PhD at Harvard University and she majored pragmatics and semantics, but as a linguist, I was so impressed because she really made contribution to go on to the sign language and linguistics. So thank you. And her talk is probably go to 6:30. And boundaries of formal grammar, sign language, loci. Okay.
And the slides are not on there.
Slide the
I'll get started. Thank you very much for inviting me to give my talk here. My talk will, similar to the last one, will be quite a divergence from the miracle creed and boxing, but I will hopefully at some broader abstract level there is a connection to, for example, division of labor. Upon getting new language data, exactly what will function to account for. So I will be talking mostly about semantics and pragmatics. Hope you enjoy. This is a collaborative work that started out at the Meaning and Modality Lab. The PI is Catherine Davison. All three of us were at one point at Harvard working on this project. Now Kate is still at Harvard and Ray is at Johns Hopkins. The start of this talk is a very broad question about the scope of our studies. Linguistics is often defined as the study of language as part of human cognition. So we might ask, where exactly is the boundary, the narrow language faculty and the broader cognition? And we found sign languages, and specifically sign language loci, which is basically just broadly the use of signing space by signers, to be a very relevant topic for investigating this question. Sign language loci, namely the use of signing space, has been found across sign languages. So not only the well-studied ones, but newly emerging sign languages like Nicaraguan Sign Language, as well as home sign, which is a simple communication system that a deaf child might develop to communicate with their caregivers. The reason we think sign language loci are interesting for this question is that they have been implemented for phenomena such as feature agreement and binding, which are very abstract aspects of the linguistic system. However, at the same time, they implement concepts such as depiction and deixis, which are non-linguistic systems from spatial cognition. Sign language loci have been studied mainly in two areas, in the nominal domain and the verbal domain, with rather different formal treatments. So in the nominal domain, what we have is a signer pointing to different spaces in the signing space. So in the picture here, Brittany is pointing to some location, we're just labeling it A, and then signing read, and that would be he reads. It's just like a pronoun. Alternatively, you could have just repeated the noun, Jin read, or simply drop the pronoun. So read on its own would also be similar. In the verbal domain, instead of pointing to different locations in the space, a sign for a verb is modified to indicate who's doing what. So the citation form for help would look something like this. And depending on who is helping whom, you would modify the location of this verb. So if I am helping you, I would sign it from myself to you. If she is helping her, then I could also modify the verbs that way. And these have been called inflecting verbs in many works. So the questions we could ask is, these phenomena, are these language exclusive, or is it part of a larger cognitive system? Should we be defining it in terms of narrow language faculty or not? And the second question is it language universal or modality specific? Is it specific to sign languages only, or do we actually do something very similar in spoken languages too? The answers to these questions cover a wide range, from those that say that use of signing space is fully non-linguistic, it's just gestural, and it's random by signers, to those that say that these are highly linguistic, so arguing that these are semantic indices, syntactic agreement, and there are analyses in between as well. Our analysis will also fall somewhere in between. We will be arguing that sign language loci are both fundamentally linguistic. They are modifiers, just like adjectives or adverbs, and they're fundamentally spatial. They express some association with a physical space. And we will further argue that this is the same phenomenon both in the verbal and the nominal domain. Even though they're having two very different treatments, they really are the same phenomenon. And they are found across modalities. This is not specific to sign languages. Speakers do it all the time as well. So I will start with loci in the verbal domain, and then move on to the nominal domain. We have a very short empirical study testing our analysis, and then I will conclude with some questions. So loci in the verbal domain. Verbs in sign languages are often described to be divided into three distinctions. So the ASL, as an example, has three verb classes. The first class is called inflecting verbs. These are verbs that mark person information of arguments. So an example that I've already shown would be something like help. So help, depending on who's helping whom, you move the sign. So she's helping her, I am helping you. Other examples would be something like kick, give, or tell. There are also spatial verbs. Instead of marking person information, what they mark are spatial locations. So here is an example of move in ASL. So depending on where you're moving, I could move here or here. So spatial verbs. Other ones would be like point. The plain verbs are negatively defined from these. These are verbs that do not mark any personal location information. So they stay put regardless of who's doing what or where these are happening. So an example is shown in love. So love is anchored to the body regardless of who's loving whom. And other things like think and dance are also categorized as a plain verb. And to elaborate on the inflecting verbs, we have already seen the verb help. In order for me to use different loci, so different locations in the signing space, and modify help, I first need to establish who's where. So in one, before I could use help from A to B, for example, I would have to associate, let's say, Jin over here and Sol over here. So that's done by the first sentence. So it would be, I met Jin here and Sol B. So X to A is just an indexical handshake pointing to A or B. So Jin over here, Sol over here. I have established Jin and Sol in different places. After that, subsequent signing of help from here to here would mean Jin help Sol. Help from B to A would mean Sol help Jin. So that's how inflecting verbs would be used. And they have very reasonably have been argued to be syntactic subject-object agreement. Just like we have conjugations and any verb agreement, the verb is modified to show who the subject is or who the object is. Andrew Nevins argues against this agreement view, arguing that these should be seen as clitics rather than agreement. So here he's using the definition of agreement as syntactic elements realized on functional heads. So very simplified definition. Versus clitics, which are the elements that have been reduced, but they are crucially separate from verbs. The reason he argues that these are clitics rather than agreement are nicely listed in his work, but the two main arguments, which he calls significant departures from agreement, are as follows. The first is object primacy, meaning that objects are marked much more in sign language verbs than subjects. So there are many cases of verbs where the subject is not marked, but the object is marked by the verb. And at least typologically, there's a generalization that subject agreement is much more common than object agreement. So if we argue that these are agreement, we have to explain why in sign languages this is done backwards. The second, more critical problem is what he calls subset problem or optionality. So as I already mentioned, sign language verbs are divided into 3 different categories, and only the inflecting verbs show inflection. And that seems to be problematic because when we have an analysis of a language that has verb agreement, agreement occurs on every verb rather than just a subset of verbs. On the other hand, clitics across languages have been shown to be optional. So this seems to be a better fit than agreement, which is syntactically obligatory. Lorenzo and Wilbur argue against this view against agreement, saying that the subset problem actually doesn't have to be a problem. For them, what they do is they redefine what agreement is for sign languages. If you recall, the inflecting verbs that I've shown you from ASL, they always involve some kind of a movement from one location to the other, help, kick, give. They argue that even verbs such as dance, which is often traditionally analyzed as a plain verb, can show agreement if they are signed at a different location. So dance is a plain verb, but if you have this dance signed at some location associated with A, that's agreement. And therefore, they remove the subset problem because plain verbs can also show agreement. And so they look at Libras, the Brazilian Sign Language, and argue that all verbs in Libras can show collocation unless phonologically restricted. So phonologically restricted simply means that if your sign is actually produced anchored to the body, then there is no phonetic way for you to move the sign. If that is not the case, all verbs in Libras can show collocation, therefore subset problem does not exist. Our project started by taking issue with the modal they were using, the can, because oftentimes when we talk about syntactic agreement, the modal we should be using isn't can, but must. All verbs, all instances of verbs show agreement rather than some subsets of verbs showing agreement at some times. So our paper argues that token optionality is the main issue. So instead of type optionality, the subset problem, token optionality really seems to be the issue for the syntactic agreement view. So agreement applies to every instance of a verb in a language that has agreement. However, in sign languages, not every instance of a verb is modified. And that is supported by the evidence from Fenlon et al. And Shembri, who look at British Sign Language, a corpus study. And they show that verbs occur with directional modification, that's agreement, in approximately 70% of all tokens. So not 100%, but only in 70% of tokens, signers actually show modification. They also list some idiosyncrasies that they find. So for example, the verb push is modified only 5 times out of 12, while the verb pay is modified 20 out of 26 times. And they also find some other general patterns, like the more animate, the more modified. Based on these findings, they conclude that modification is fully gestural. It's not a syntactic agreement that is obligatory given to every instance of verb. Instead, it's just a gestural construction that signers may decide to produce or not. For us, while we agree with Fenlon et al. And Shembri et al. That there is some idiosyncratic patterns, we think that there is an explanation for it. It's not just random, and pragmatics could actually help us understand why we have such idiosyncrasies. So recall that pay was modified much more often than push. If we look at different arguments that could fill in the subject and object of pay in 5, Jin could pay Sol, who could pay Jin back. Jin could also pay inanimate entities like the bank or the company that could also pay Jin back. So argument reversing is possible, meaning that the object could also serve as a subject of the verb. On the other hand, push, if we have other examples in 6, Jin could push Sol, who could push him back. But if Jin pushes his car or the wall, his car and the wall cannot push Jin. So argument reversal is much harder, just pragmatically speaking and our oral knowledge. So the idea is that because there is a more pragmatic need for disambiguation for pay, but not push, signers are actually modifying the verbs more. So that would explain that first idiosyncrasy. And interestingly, Fenlon et al. Also show that animate nouns are more likely to show modification, but there is an exception in British Sign Language. The verb is look after, And they note that even though the patients are often animate, like baby or cat, these are not often modified. So they leave this as a puzzle. And our pragmatic story can naturally explain this as well, that oftentimes we're the ones looking after a baby or a cat, not the other way around. Maybe an exception with a cat. But except for that, it is more natural for us to, the locus modification is less necessary for look after than, for example, pay. So based on this, we argue that argument reversal, this pragmatic notion, plays a role. The observation is that optional verb modification negatively correlates with the likelihood of argument reversal. And the hypothesis is that verb modification is pragmatically licensed for disambiguation. So it's not syntax, it's more pragmatic. So we consulted 3 native signers of ASL, asked them to judge 30 sentences that varied on relative need for disambiguation, and this was presented by Anne-Marie, who is a native signer of ASL. The factors that we manipulated to get different instrumentalization of need for disambiguation were number of reference and presence of narrative. So I'll explain what that means. Number of competing reference is a very simple notion, namely that if you're only talking about one person in your narrative, it's very clear who you're talking about. So in 8, if you have a narrative of a boy entering club, the music is on and dance, then it's obvious that it's the boy that we're talking about who's dancing. In 9, there's a competing referent introduced, so a boy enters the club, sees a girl reading, music is on and dance. Now there's more ambiguity on who's dancing. So that was the first factor we manipulated. The second was narrative. So in 10, we have Mary's hanging out with Sue, and then just the verb push. Here, it's unclear who's doing the pushing. But in 11, if you add some kind of a narrative, Mary hangs out with Sue, Sue says something very bad, Mary gets really angry and push, there's at least more contextual evidence for who's doing the pushing. So these were the 2 simple modifications we had. And for our verb modification, we adopted the notion of collocation from Lorenzo and Wilbur. So plain verbs like dance also can be displaced at a different locus for us. So the verbs that are not modified with locus marking are shown in 12. It would simply be dance in the neutral position or held in the neutral position. While the plus locus ones would be dance that is at some location. So if Jin is here and I sign dance here, that would be seen as plus locus verb. And help if it's moving from A to B. So these were the factors we tested. So just to give you a very short summary of what we found from the consultation, we found that the number of reference affected verb locus use. So in 14, if you have boy enter club, music is on, and I simply sign dance without a locus modification, all 3 signers were okay with that. They said it was clear. In 15, if we added a girl, so boy enters a club, sees a girl read, music is on, and just dance at the plain location, then 2 signers really rejected it. 1 signer said it's only possible if you're giving the narrative from the boy's perspective. And in 16, if you create loci, so boy is over here, enters club, sees girl here, reading, music is on, and dance, sign at this locus, then the signers were fine with this sentence. So when it is clear who danced, locus is not needed. That was the conclusion from this section. And with the narrative factor, we found that locus modification is not necessary. So in 17, if you have Sue hang out with Mary and just push, they did not like it. But if you actually create locus for Sue and Mary and do push, even without the narrative, that's completely fine. But if you add a narrative and get rid of the locus, that was also fine. So you could say, Sue hangs out with Mary, Mary says something terrible, Sue got angry, and just push in the neutral position. That was accepted by all of our signers as well. And this, I could actually skip this and come back to the last point in the second section. So our conclusion from this small consultation study was that there's preliminary evidence for pragmatically licensed verb modification. We found that verb modification is not obligatory, which is a problem for the syntactic account, and verb modification is needed when it's unclear who did what. It's really for disambiguation purposes. And it can be dropped if it's clear who did what. So if you're only talking about one referent in the narrative, or the context tells you who. The implication of locus marking on verbs is that it's not syntactic agreement because it's optional. It's not random, it has some pragmatic licensing, and these should be analyzed as the expressions that are separate from verbs. So these are clitic-like, then agreement. Our analysis for this would be making use of this notion of incorporation. So incorporation is a common morphological process in sign language where you would combine different parameters of a sign, of two signs, to create a new sign. So here there's an example for 6 months in ASL. This is the sign for 6, and this is the sign for month. Sorry, I'm holding a mic so it's less clear. And if you combine the hand shape of this 6 sign to the rest, the movement and the location of this month sign, you get 6 months, like this. And this is productive, so if you have different numbers, you could get 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, and so on. The main idea of incorporation is that some parameter, either location, hand shape, or movement of a sign, is combined into other parameters of another sign. And we argue that that's exactly what's happening with verbs like help from A to B. In 21, help that is modified from A to B is actually an incorporated version of he helps him. So there are 2 pronouns, X to A and X to B, the locations of which have been incorporated into the verb help. And the same thing for dance. Dance, signed at location A, is an incorporated version of she dances. So XA, help is literally something like this person over here helps this person. So we have argued that loci on verbs are the element, which is very much in line with the clitic's view, though the idea is actually coming from the opposite angle. Cliticization often in spoken languages are seen as reduced the element, so instead of having a full-fledged the element, you could criticize it and shorten it. For us, it's actually modified verbs are marked verbs. So these are verbs that could have come with just null pronouns, but because of disambiguation reasons, they are coming with locations added to them. And our analysis makes use of independently motivated ingredients, incorporation, which is a common sign language morphology, as well as collocation. And one of the implications of this is that we reduce the lexical specification of verbs. One of the odd things about sign language verbs is that three-way distinction, inflecting, spatial, and plain, and we believe that if we argue that these are pronouns incorporated onto the verb, we don't need that kind of three-way distinction. That's stipulative only for sign languages. So inflecting verbs, in our view, are verbs with personal pronouns incorporated, so she helps her. Spatial verbs are just verbs with locational pronouns incorporated, so I put there, and there is incorporated into the verb. So we no longer need to stipulate a three-way distinction. Now moving on to loci in the nominal domain, I have argued so far that help modified from A to B is underlyingly point A, help, point B. Now we ask, what is locus? And I've already used this in several glosses, but X to locus, as shown here, X is the indexable handshake with subscript A, just a variable for some locus. And this is used as follows in 24. Again, you create a locus for someone. So you could say, I met boy A, girl B, and then pointing to A would mean the boy was busy. So it's used very much like pronominal anaphoric definite. And X has reasonably has been argued as some kind of a D element, as a definite determiner, as a demonstrative, as a pronoun, and so on. And very influentially in the formal semantics domain, loci have been analyzed as overt instantiations of indices that occur with pronouns. So any semantic frameworks that make use of variables and indices for an aphra, the idea would be as follows. So 25, a very simple intersentential anaphora. You have Jin and Mike. We assume that every noun comes with some kind of an index that we keep track of. So that's done in this framework with an assignment function. The assignment function simply says 1 maps onto Jin, 2 maps onto the Mike. Then a pronoun that has some kind of an index that matches this would simply refer to whoever is at that mapping. So he dropped it would mean Jin dropped the Mike. And the implication from arguing that loci are analyzed as overt instantiations of indices were actually quite large. Indices, which we never see in actual spoken languages, are overtly realized in sign languages. That would be the implication. And moreover, sign languages might be argued to provide support for variables. So there still is a big debate on whether variables should be used in our semantic theory, and sign languages have been argued to show support that there are variables because we actually see indices overtly. Despite the nice logic from this, we argue against this view because if indices are overt in ASL, we should actually see indices in all anaphoric contexts, because indices in semantic frameworks are used for anaphora, meaning every anaphoric context should show loci use. And that's obviously not the case. ASL makes use of various anaphoric expressions that don't make use of the locations. So ASL and many other sign languages can drop their pronouns, so a null argument is perfectly fine. I could sign I met boy and simply sign happy to mean he was happy, where there's no overt use of locations. Bare nouns are also possible. I met boy, boy happy is also fine, again no locus. And the use of ix can be done in two positions. One is to a locus, as we already saw in 29. But another use is where I don't actually create a locus for boy and simply point straight forward. So that's what ix neutral is. It's a subscription neutral for neutral position. So I could sign I met boy, he was happy, would also be fine. Again, here I'm not actually using loci as we would expect if loci were indices. And Frederickson and Mayberry also have a very nice study asking 12 native signers of ASL to describe a 6-panel picture. And what they did was count all of the anaphoric expressions used in the language. And the details aside, what we see is in the bolded columns, so these are all different kinds of anaphoric expressions that can be used in the language, ix only appears 6 times out of 340 tokens. So that's not a lot at all, suggesting that really loci aren't there at every anaphoric context. And Todd Zubek has a dissertation showing that ix is actually more frequent in more complex discourse, which is also very similar to the pragmatic disambiguation kind of view we're looking after. So just like in the first one, we had a small consultation with the same 3 signers, and this time we had the same factors, number of reference and presence of narrative, but what we tested was not verb modification, but the pronoun use. So we asked whether the null argument, simply dropping the pronoun, the bare noun, the ix neutral, and locus use were reasonable and acceptable in these factors. So to summarize our consultation data, loci are not obligatory. So this is first empirical suggestion in the field to argue that loci really are not obligatory by signers. So all anaphoric expressions, loci or not, were felicitous when there is just one referent. So if it's obvious who's doing what, you could of course create a locus for boy and point back to boy and say he danced. But null, bare noun, and neutral ix were also all possible. So this would be something like in 31, where I don't create a locus for boy, and I simply follow up with a null argument, bare noun, or ix neutral. And 3 of our signers all preferred the neutral ix when it was one referent, when it was simple enough. We also found that loci are not always licensed, so ix locus is actually bad for inanimate reference. So if we have a sentence such as 32, girl A buys a book B, A happy, that was fine. But if girl A bought book B and B is about pirates, signers really did not like pointing to B. So this is a restriction based on anatus. And the number of referents affected the locus use. So if you have a boy and girl introduced, but I simply drop the pronoun or use ix neutral, signers did not like it. It's ambiguous who's dancing. In 35, if I use the bare noun, then of course this is disambiguated. We know that the boy danced, so that was fine. And if we created loci for boy and girl, and I pointed to xa, that was also fine. And similarly, the presence of narrative affected locus use. So if there's no locus, no narrative in 37, null argument or neutral ix was very bad for push. But if you have a narrative added in 39, then null argument or neutral ix was also fine. So here too, we have preliminary evidence for pragmatically licensed the use of base locus. Locus in anaphoric expressions is first of all optional. It's not licensed with all noun types. It's needed for when it's unclear who did what, but it's not needed if it's clear who did what. So the implications are exactly the same as in the verbal domain. Loci are not semantic indices because semantic indices are always obligatory for any kind of anaphoric expression, but that's not the case for locus. So we argue that its locus is some marked anaphoric expression. So the empirical study that we did was simply to test with a larger set of signers whether our hypothesis of pragmatic licensing actually holds. So the main hypothesis was locus used in ASL in both nouns and verbs is pragmatically licensed to disambiguate between potential antecedents. So pragmatic licensing of locus in both nominal and verbal domain. The sub-hypotheses are very simple. The first is simply saying that if the semantic role assignment is unambiguous, if we know who's doing what, then locus can be dropped in both nominal and verbal domain. In two, if semantic role assignment is ambiguous, we don't actually know who's doing what, we need disambiguation, that's when locus is used. Our third sub-hypothesis was based on just pragmatic redundancy effects, that if it's very clear who's doing what, but the signer actually decides to put locus, that would actually be degraded. And the possible options for our stimuli were these four. Basically, let's consider a narrative where a girl is traveling and then she's reading. A woman is sitting next to her and she asked her for directions. So that would be one of the stimuli. There are four possible combinations of locus marking. First, in 40, we could not mark locus on either the nominal or the verbal domain. So that's what you have. We simply have sentences, girl travel, girl read, woman sit, ask direction. On the ask direction, there's no noun locus. There's no locus marking on the ask direction as well. In 41, we have nominal locus marking. So 41 through 43, we create loci for girl and the woman. And you can focus on the last question. So we have she asks direction. So ask is not modified, but we're pointing to indicate who's doing what. In 42, only the verb is marked, so we don't actually point to give over pronouns, but we have ask that is modified. In 43, we have both the pointing and the modification of verbs. So she asks her direction. And in this test, we only focused on the minimally locus marked one and the maximally locus marked one, 40 versus 43. So that's how we would indicate minus and plus locus mark. So that was our first factor. Whether it's locusly marked or not. The second factor was contextual support. Basically, whether it was clear who did what. And you saw very similar kind of stimuli already from our consultation data, but the three proxies we used were number of reference, whether there was a narrative present to indicate who's doing what, and animus. So here would be the number of reference factor, and I'll just briefly go over what this would look like. In the clear context, we simply have one referent, Linda, being discussed. Linda goes to the beach, Linda walks near the water, and fall. So that's just, it's clear that it's Linda who's falling. We would manipulate whether there is locus marking or not, so minus locus versus plus locus. In the non-clear factor, we would introduce another reference. So Linda goes to the beach, but Will walks near the water, and then now we have the sentence fall. And minus locus or plus locus. Same thing for the narrative. We manipulated whether there's a narrative to indicate who's doing what versus not, and crossed it with the locus marking. And animacy was based on our argument reversal argument. So we argued that the context is clear if the patient is inanimate, because only the animate subject can be the agent of the verb. It's clear who's doing what. For example, if Mike enters the living room and sees a TV and pushes, it's Mike that's doing the pushing rather than the TV. On the other hand, if the patient was actually animate, so Mike sees Bob and push, it's less clear who's doing what. And so here, we tried very hard to recruit our native signers, and we hit a record of 78 native signers of ASL, which is extremely difficult, but we actually had to filter many of our participants and end up with an N of 26. And that was done through the data filtering here. 44 and 45, we made sure that they were passing two very baseline items. So for example, in 44, if we told them that Linda went to the beach, she walked near the water, and she fell, and we asked them who fell, and if they answered Will, they failed the test. In 45, if we told them Mike entered the living room, he saw a TV, and he pushed it, and we asked them who pushed, and they said the TV, they failed the test as well. So we believe that this is a problem of online recruitment that we were doing. If you have recommendations for better norming our participants, I would highly welcome that. So here's just a trial preview. We had our study fully in ASL, so the instructions were not in English. It was signed by a native signer. And they would then see the sentences that you saw in the tables just now. We will first ask them who danced or who fell, and they would have to choose if it's Linda or Will. And then they were asked to rate how good the sentence was, and we used this scale. And our results are as follows. The choice data is from the first question, who's dancing, who's falling. And what we see is the legends are very small, but the blue bars are plus locus, gray bars are minus locus, and the three different columns are number, narrative, and animacy factor. And what we see is, in each column, these would be the minus clear, so it's not clear who's doing what. These are the context tells you who's doing what. So what we see overall is that, first of all, blue bars are very high, showing that if you do mark your verbs or nouns with locus, then it's clear who's doing what. They choose the right participants, compared to the gray bars that are not locus marked. And if you compare the first pair of columns to the second, we see that they are higher, meaning that if context tells you who's doing what, then even without locus, the gray bars are much higher. So if you focus only on the gray bars, these are the ones without locus marking on verb or noun. We see that when it's clear who's doing what, it's much higher, significantly higher for the choice data. So regardless of the factor, participants were more likely to choose the intended referent if there was contextual support or if locus overtly marked it. And our ratings data look exactly the same. So we see, again, that the blue bars are overall higher because locus marks who's doing what, and the gray bars in each of these columns are higher, at least for the number and the animacy factor, if the context tells you who's doing what. So our sub-hypothesis 1 was supported. We do see that there is higher rating for minus locus, the gray bars, the ones that do not have any locus marking when the context tells you who's doing what. And second, the mirror picture of that, lower rating for minus locus when it's unclear. We actually don't have any evidence for participants finding redundant sentences in unambiguous context to be degraded. We don't have any evidence, for example, for the blue bars here, when it's clear who's doing what, and you still mark the verbs and the nouns with locus, we don't actually see participants finding that degraded. So, putting these together, locus used in ASL is pragmatically licensed to disambiguate between potential antecedents. So, we have seen that loci are optional. Even sentences without loci are not rated at 0, so they're not ungrammatical, which is surprisingly not an observation that has been focused on in the syntactic discussion of analyzing these as a group. And loci use is licensed for disambiguation, and one caveat is that the proxies we used for the clear were not normed at all, so narrative, number, and animacy were simply our guesses on what would make a context clear, so we would need to further investigate whether these were really making the context clear as we wanted. So the conclusion for this mini study was that loci are optional elements added for disambiguation, not for anaphora or not for agreement. And this parallels in other languages where they use modifiers, so indefinite descriptions such as the linguist versus the tall Korean linguist who lives in Seoul. These additional modifiers are used in order for disambiguation in contexts where maybe just the NP alone is not enough, and we find that to be fully parallel. So our analysis for this, we argue that ix locus is a modifier. So if you look at the sentence again, XA dances, the English translation is often he dances, she dances, they dance, and so on. So previous accounts have all assumed that XA itself is a pronoun, like he or she. In my dissertation, I argue that XA, this actual sign, should not be a pronoun, it actually should be a modifier. So the evidence for this comes from the fact that X locus occurs with antecedents too. So as I mentioned, in order for me to produce a sentence like this, XA dance and make sense, I first have to establish some entity to locus A. So that would be in 46 with Jin. So if I establish Jin over here and Sol over here, in this first use, the antecedent use, it would be very odd to argue that XA and XB are pronouns because Jin and Sol are already definite, they are expressions, and we would have to argue that they are co-occurring with another pronoun that is anaphoric to them. So instead of doing that, I would like to argue that they are modifiers that co-occur with this R expression. So in order to elaborate on this point a bit more, our view is that XA is a locational modifier that can accompany pronouns rather than be pronouns themselves. So cross-linguistically, we know that pronouns can be accompanied by pointing. So I could say in English, she and point, which would be different from she over here. Same thing with that girl versus that girl. Pointing actually is restricted for these. And same thing for other languages too. So in Mandarin, ta can also be accompanied by pointing. In ASL, what we're arguing is that XA is that accompanying pointing gesture, and the pronoun is null in this language. So there's a null head combining with a modifier that is pointing. So X locus is a locational modifier. It's going to relate some entity to some location O. And there's an underspecified associated with relation. So in 47, X locus is analyzed as arguing, give me some location argument, give me some entity, and I will return true if there's some relation between that entity and that location. So the most basic one would be just being at that location. And so XA is going to be a one-place predicate, taking an entity and returning true if A has some relation to this entity X. And this again is fully parallel to other modifiers. So for example, the word smart would be a one-place predicate saying, give me an entity, I will return true if X is smart. Who is from Seoul, give me an entity, I will return true if X is from Seoul. XA is doing exactly that. So the consequence is that we can explain why X locus appears both with antecedents and anaphoric expressions. In the antecedent, it's going to be in a positive. So one nice property of modifiers that we can borrow is that modifiers can be supplementary or restrictive. So in the antecedent sentence, we argue that the modifier of being at A is added as an appositive. It's a supplementary modification. So Jin A is basically Jin, who is by the way at A. In the anaphoric context, with the anaphoric expression, now the modifier is actually restrictive. So here, if you have X locus, this is the unique entity that is at that location. So it's just a definite description with the modifier being an A, just like the smart one, it's the one at this location. And XA dance would be the unique entity that is associated with location A danced. So a positive in the antecedent use, restrictive in the anaphoric use. And there are many parallels we can find in other sign languages as well as spoken languages. We know that in other sign languages like Nicaraguan Sign Language, you can use a predicate as a label. So here is a very nice excerpt from Senha's work in 49. I'll just read the English translation. The narrative goes, the man falls down head over heels, feathers float down and the man collects them. So collecting is the important predicate. The birds laugh, the collector looks up. In the sign language, in Nicaraguan Sign Language, all you see in the subject position is the verb collect. You don't see any kind of definite marking, it's just the verb collect, look up, and it's translated as the collector or whoever collects, the one who collects, looked up. That's going to anaphorically refer to the man because the man was established as collecting something. So the similarities between this analysis and our analysis is the use of a predicate with an empty head in an anaphoric use. So just like empty collect is the collector, empty XA is the one who is at A. We can also do this in relative clauses in English. So in 50, I could decide to introduce two entities to you with relative clauses that are supplementary. So I saw this poet who was from Pennsylvania and this linguist who was from New York at the conference last night. My fellow Pennsylvanian greeted me kindly, but the New Yorker seemed upset about something. Here, what I have done is add some supplementary information to the poet and the linguist with relative clauses, and then use that information restrictively in subsequent anaphoric pickup of that entity. So that seems to be, again, very similar to our treatment of ex locus as a positive in antecedent and anaphoric and restrictive in the definite use. We could also turn this relative clause to an abstract label. So instead of someone who is from New York, I could say, I saw this poet, who I'll call A, and this linguist, who I'll call B, at the conference. A greeted me kindly, but B seemed upset about something. This seems to be something we could do quite naturally in spoken languages, and the similarity is the use of abstract labels. So in sign language, we do it with different locations, but in spoken language, we could use maybe abstract labels like ABC or numbers. And finally, we have a fully parallel example. A similar example can also be found in Cornelia Ebert's work. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to produce the English sentence, but point to different locations. So I could say, I saw a poet and a linguist at the conference last night. He greeted me kindly, but he seemed upset about something. Slightly degraded, but you can actually get the anaphoric pickup from the locations. So the similarities are use of location and pointing in order to label something and then anaphorically pick it up later. So to summarize what I have argued so far, I've argued that the directional modification of a verb like help is underlying me, he helps he, him. And in the anaphoric use, there's actually a null pronoun. And this pointing is not a pronoun in itself, but the modifier. And so help, directionally modified from A to B, would mean the one associated with A help the one associated with B. And we don't actually need any kind of science-specific stipulation to get to this, because all of the properties here, empty heads being used with predicates, a positive use, and then restricted use of modifiers, abstract labels, as well as use of locations, are found in both signed and spoken without B. So to conclude, loci use in sign languages for a very long time have received very disjoint science-specific analyses. So verb loci have been argued to be agreement or critics with this three-way distinction in the verb clauses. And the nominal domain, ex locus, has been argued and assumed to be overt indices, which seems very different from what we do in spoken languages. The empirical aspect that seems to be very important but has been missing is optionality, token optionality, the fact that this locus use is not obligatory in sign languages. And we showed that this optionality is pragmatically licensed for disambiguation and have found a lot of parallels in spoken languages as well. The analysis was ex locus is a spatial predicate. It's independently motivated ingredients such as empty heads, incorporation, or positives, use of labels as well have been used. And this allows for a unified account across nominals in the verbal domain, as well as unified account across modalities. So it seems to be the locus used in sign languages are much simpler than we have once thought. So in the nominal domain, XA reads is a D element with modifier. He over here reads, just like in spoken languages. In the verbal domain, it's verbs with D elements that are incorporated. And so our analysis falls somewhere in between, arguing that ex locus is fundamentally linguistic modifiers, just like relative clauses, but they encode fundamentally spatial information. That seems to be coming specifically from the modality-specific property. And we do this in spoken languages too, just at a lesser degree, because for us, the main modality of our communication is oral rather than tactile. So some broader questions and implications to end this talk. Just to push the boundaries slightly more, I have focused mostly on spatial lexis, but we might ask, can this be extended to depiction? there's a lot of semanticists nowadays testing and investigating semantics of gestures. So we know that sign language names have iconic features. So can we do something similar in spoken languages? We seem to have some ability to incorporate depictions to our assertive content. So for example, in 53, if I say I ran like this, and I depict running, then this running actually is true conditionally relevant. You could say, no, that's not true, you didn't run that fast, or something like that. Or I could say the fish was this big, you could say that's not true, the fish was actually much smaller. But it seems like in spoken languages, we actually need a demonstrative to combine the depictive content into the spoken context. If I simply said, I ran, it would be very odd for you to reject that sentence because of how I depicted the running. So demonstratives really seems to play a key role. And another question could be, can spoken languages use deixis in depiction without speech? So can you actually have gestures that are pro-speech rather than co-speech? That's another area that has been investigated quite a lot recently. And the third question, which I have been very interested in personally, is why are demonstratives special? So why do demonstratives allow incorporation of the two modalities that other parts of the language don't seem to have? And I am recently arguing that there's some kind of a unique modality hypothesis, a constraint, saying that you can't have semantic composition across modalities. You can't just have a tree where one node is spoken and the other node is gestural and simply combine it and come up with something that is in one modality. What you need is a lexical operator that takes a gestural element as its first argument and a spoken element as its second argument and combine it. And specifically, I argue that across languages, demonstratives play that role as a lexical operator. So that would be one way of answering why demonstratives would be special. So that's it for the talk. Thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, actually we have 24 minutes. And so, yeah, is there anybody who can come? Oh, yeah, already have.
Sorry for always being the first. Okay, so thank you very much, Dorothy, for this wonderful talk. It's really eye-opening and pretty refreshing as well, especially at the end of the day. So I have two questions actually. The first one is more general, and the second one is a bit more specific. So I'll start with the more general question. So speaking as a working syntactician, I kind of couldn't help but wonder what a derivation might look like for this kind of pragmatic conditioning for word. Say, at which point in the architecture of grammar, let's say, do you still assume the same kind of particular grammar as we do as syntacticians, as linguist syntacticians?
Yes, the starting point would be that we assume the same syntactic and semantic configuration and the mechanism of composition. And this actually is a question that applies to other pragmatic treatments of definite descriptions in spoken languages too, right? If we know that there are some pragmatic principles guiding which kind of definite expression to use based on how clear it is, where do they actually apply?
Yeah.
And I think answers differ based on who you're talking to. And I have tried to argue that there is some kind of a pragmatic interface as low as a DP, but I don't think there is empirical evidence for that. The same kind of account can be done at a sentential level too, or even at a discourse level. So I think whatever we say about the spoken language, we should be able to parallelly argue for sign languages. But in terms of exactly what is an open question.
But this must happen at the lexical level, right?
At the lexical level because
yeah,
we're using...
syntax will need to build the structure.
Yes, yep, so this could be one, maybe that's where sign languages actually specifically give us some evidence for where that interface might happen.
Yeah, and also based on building on that question, that's a big if such pragmatic conditioning could, say, in sign languages happen at a lexical level, or at least at a lexicon and syntax interface, then we need some sort of encoding, right? I'd say in terms of features, syntactic features. Then I noticed that you use, I might be wrong, so you use a loc as a feature in your talk.
Yes, so
the plus minus loc.
Yeah, so I don't consider it to be a real syntactic feature. feature, but I simply used it for the experimental stimuli and the factors. But that could definitely be something we could consider, and exactly what that feature would mean would be an open question. Could it be actual locus marking as a feature, or could it be more broader concepts like saliency and contrast? Yeah.
Exactly. But if that, I mean, again, that's a big case. If that could be conceived as some sort of form of feature, then there's the question of learnability. I mean, how can children learn to postulate such a feature, especially given, again, I might be wrong, but I remember you mentioning at a certain point in the talk of the lecture that even though some verbs that usually go with such marking are fine, those verbs that don't usually get such marking can also be optionally marked. That wouldn't lead to ungrammatical judgment, right?
Yes.
But then, how can children have the cue in input data?
Yes, yeah, so what do they actually get in the input, and what do they need in their initial search in order for them to actually
Exactly,
rely on the system?
exactly.
Yes, for sure. And I don't think this would answer your question directly, but it's a question that I would very much like to investigate further, so thank you. So in discussing the verbal modification as optional, one of the comments we received is that at least for some signers of ASL, they really are starting to look more like agreement. So there seems to be some relevant learnability effects that are happening, and this is something that parallels spoken languages too, right? Diachronically, clitics, they start out as clitics and become agreement. So maybe learnability and this input issue could be leading to that change.
That sounds like a very, very promising route to pursue.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks a lot
Thank
for the
you.
clarification. Thank you.
Thank you. This is fascinating. I have two questions. The first one is about the competition between the three available strategies to pick up reference. So I was looking at 31, where you were reporting the results that loci are not obligatory. Yeah, so I was a little surprised to see in 31 that all of these three strategies are available, because I had thought of the bear boy as sort of like the definite descriptions in spoken languages and X as pronouns. And obviously in English, there's a preference for pronouns over definite descriptions in these situations. But I see that you're writing here that neutral X was preferred with one referent. Is there any competition between the no choice and the bear choice?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think in English too, there's a question of how strongly we want to pursue this competition view, because it is true that we prefer pronouns in contexts like this. The boy entered the club, he danced versus the boy danced. And there are also disjoint referent effects, right? So as soon as you say, or not the disjoint referent effect, but the noun, repeated noun penalty, that there's a penalty for repeating the noun when you didn't have to. And that kind of markiness seems to occur in sign languages too. Our signers definitely said that neutral X is much better than signing boy again. Whether there's a competition between the null argument and X neutral really would require more of a larger empirical study that we couldn't capture at this consultation level. But my prediction would be that if there is a pragmatic economy principle that really rolls across all of the expressions we could use, that the null argument might be better. There might be this economy principle clashing with some other pragmatic and discourse principles that we might want to consider as well. For example, in ASL and many other languages, the bare noun boy can be not just anaphoric, but kind denoting or indefinite. And if you wanted to mark that it's anaphoric, you might actually add a demonstrative for spoken languages, which is pragmatically more semantic work, but there is some discourse function in place. But yes, definitely something I should investigate further.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So the second question is about the predictions of your analysis that loci makes contributions similarly to the positives. So I was thinking about how donkey sentences would work. So if I say something in spoken language in English, like if John has a donkey, which I will call A, I think I only get the specific reading. I don't think it's possible to get donkey reading that people normally talk about.
Yeah, you're right, that if I actually add an appositive to the donkey, then we don't get the donkey and anaphora
Yeah.
reading. And that's a great point, thank you. I know that Philippe Schlenker has work that looks at donkey and anaphora in French Sign Language and shows that, I guess, maybe in his work, he actually empirically shows that donkey and anaphora is possible with pointing. But I don't actually know if he went further into testing whether it's a specific donkey versus the donkey.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes,
Okay, thank
definitely
you.
something I should look into. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the very interesting talk. I really liked it. So I have one question which is kind of related to Moon's question and one comment which is related to this question. So I'm kind of curious about the optional case marking. So do in it is also in optional cases, do you have or do they have different pragmatic interpretations? Like, so in project languages in general, when you don't have to use, so for example, say in Korean and Japanese, right? You don't have, you can drop pronouns. But if you pronounce pronouns, sounds like you're focusing, right? Contrastive talk, contrastive focus kind of. Do you have a similar effect in sign languages or in American Sign Language in those cases where optional?
Yeah, so that would also be an empirical question that would be very interesting to pursue. The pragmatic discussion of loci really is a very recent phenomenon, and we don't have a lot of empirical data showing, for example, these competition within the different expressions or different interpretations that might arise. One empirical observation I know is that upon seeing a locus, so maybe not so much with the other expressions, but upon seeing a locus, signers might actually predict some kind of a contrast. So that seems to be definitely, it's slightly different from what we see in spoken languages in that it's not at the anaphoric use, but it's at the antecedent use, right? Because for us to use it, you first have to create a locus. So maybe that's not really a parallel case, but it's more of, let's say if I said, I met a boy with a red hat, as soon as I add this redundant modification, you might expect me to introduce yet another boy with a different hat. So maybe the contrast interpretation is at a different domain, but we do see similar effects like that.
Great. Yeah. And the second point is related to this. So I was intrigued by the annecy effect in American and British sign language. Given the critic-ish behavior, I was reminding myself of critic doubling or the direct argument part in, say, Spanish, for example. So DOM or DAM is typically sensitive to annecy difference, right? And this kind of looks like critic doubling in the sense that you have a locus effect on the verb and also on the noun sometimes, right? And also important names, going back to the DDA, there's a big DD analysis where you have a good dick and it's referred in the same DP in the original position, and they move different meanings in declared syntax. That might be, and you might be seeing the, for example, Jing case slightly number 49. Well, this might be, I may be wrong, but yeah, you have two different both. So these two markings depart from, say, domain. You see the markings in different places, but they are don't modify something like that. So yeah, so my point is how we could account for that effect, and this W-ish perspective might help out.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. That would be a great direction to take this because we currently, in this analysis, we have no account for why we might be sensitive to animacy, other than this very general tendency for us to mark animate objects further than inanimate objects and so on. But analyses of those, clinic-based analyses, if we incorporate that further, we might have a better answer there. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we still have time. Oh, yeah.
I'm not a semanticist at all, but I'm a psycholinguist, so I'm looking at your graphs. So on your slides, I think 42 and 43, this sort of relates to this stuff, I guess, too. So the middle set is the two reference. There's two characters in the story, right? And so there needs to be some disambiguation, and so they're prompted to use the marker to disambiguate them.
So the one in the middle is the narrative one. So, sorry,
narrative?
yeah, it's very small. Sorry, number, narrative, and animacy.
Oh, I see. Okay,
Yeah.
that would explain it. All right. See, well, then I'll just finish what I was going to say, which is not really because I thought because later you had the order that didn't order.
Yes.
Yeah. So the narrative one, this graph and the next graph, I guess, imply that that's the least helpful,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, because the bars are quite low here.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And then even though the median, I guess, that mark there, the mean is higher with the disambiguation, the range is still quite
Yes.
great.
Mhm.
So I was confused. I thought that was the two characters in the story. So the number is the first one?
Yes, the first one.
Okay, so that one you'd expect to be, I mean, if your idea is about disambiguation, that should be like the purest test, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So is that what you see here? That's
So-
really the best? Because at least in the middle one, you get the blue bar and the gray bar become almost the same, right, in the house.
Yes.
But you don't get that. You still get a difference in the number one, right?
Yeah.
The blue bar is still higher. So it's not, even though that's supposed to be the purest case where disambiguation would be necessary, you're still getting a lot of noise, right?
Yeah, you're right. And maybe I could focus on the ratings data. It's also even in the number ratings, signers are not rating the gray bars as high as the blue bars. And even in the choice data, we're seeing some lower elements. And so another way of analyzing this could be taking number as the purest case that is obvious, and then see if the noise here is actually because of participants not paying attention and further reasons for
It's a
filtering.
memory problem. I can't
Yes.
remember the character.
Yep.
I was kind of shocked. You said like 78 or almost 8 participants, and only like a third of them passed the test of just basic sign language.
Yes, yeah, and we believe that this is actually logistically due to us sharing it too broadly and non-signers taking this for their $25 Amazon gift cards. Yes. So we are currently designing a study where we actually do consultation rather than online studies. We're running into a lot of logistic issues of online studies with ASL signers just because it's not very easy for us to design one that would be natural for them. But yes, so the number we do feel is due to our mistake. But how we should analyze this is definitely a question we should investigate. The gray bars are not as high, and should we take that as, again, memory issue or maybe just not enough filtering? Yeah, yeah, thank you. Just to comment on, so Anne-Marie is a psychologist, so she was not very happy with what we came up with, but I told her it's a linguistics conference for now. But we are thinking of running this because we also skipped many of our factors that we were interested in as well, right? So minimal and maximal were tested, but not the middle ones. And we think it would be very interesting because at least in the verbal domain, people have argued that it's really become more of a syntactic obligatory agreement in some signers. So maybe we might expect some differences there too.
I have a comment on that too, actually, because I mean, every sign language has these kind of markers, and to say that you see a language change now is suspicious because, I mean, ASL goes back to French Sign Language, which must be a few hundred years old, and it would have changed by now if there really was a strong force in that direction.
Yes, that's definitely a direction we could take and say that if there that maybe the variation we see now is really a true variation rather than a change that's happening. And yes, we have no empirical evidence for supporting the previous view than the variation view. Yep. It could be nice. Anne-Marie studies Nicaraguan Sign Language, which is relatively very young. It's only the 4th generation of signers at this point. So that could be a very nice place to study whether this really can be a change or a variation. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Can I? Yeah. Yeah, very last part of your slide, you mentioned some kind of implication based on the co-speech and pro-speech. And yeah, could you please add more about this? Yeah.
So about the points here.
Yeah.
Yes, so I am in general very interested in how pointing incorporates with the rest of the sentence that we speak, and have found that many authors have found that gestural information do not actually enter at issue primary semantic computation. So the example before, so if I say I ran, you can't say that's false, you didn't run, but you can't say that's false, you didn't run like this, you ran like this, or something like that. But demonstratives really seem to play an important role in bringing the depiction to at issue truth conditional aspects. So as soon as I add demonstratives, you can reject the depiction as well. So that could lead to many different directions of research. I have been arguing that demonstratives have this special role of taking depiction and bringing it into the sentence meaning. Maybe there's something special about the different kinds of depictions that can enter the space or not. So this is very much preliminary for my end, but many authors have been trying to figure out how formal semantic apparatus can be applied to depictions as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. And
Thank you.
yeah, we still have a little bit time before dinner, so. Oh.
So just one more quick question out of curiosity. So the very last one, one of the hypotheses. What happens if two bilingual speaker signers of a spoken language and a sign language go switching and or mixing in the conversation? How would they communicate? Can it mix spoken language and sign language?
Yes, that's a great question, and I think our co-author Kate could actually give you a better empirical and theoretical discussion on that. But as far as I know, I believe that signers who are native speakers of a language and native signers of another sign language, they can combine the two codes and sign as they are speaking. But it's usually parallel information that they're giving rather than composing, for example, a verb in sign and the argument in spoken. I don't think there is at least very visible occurrences of that. So they could, instead of code switching, they could actually code blend, so that would be the terminology. But most of the information is redundant rather than actually giving new information. Yep.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, actually I have one more very personal question. How about your research field condition? Because I just started to make my research on Korean Sign Language, but you know that actually the spoken language and sign language, I believe it should be equal condition, and equality we have to treat, but it looks sometimes negative. So I just want to know, because you are doing your research on ASL, so
So research in the sign language in general is very restricted in various ways. Logistically, it's very hard to find native signers because many deaf children are not born to deaf families. And so yes, I fully agree that we need to have more researchers on this aspect, and how this actually informs us on our language faculty and our analysis seems to be very important. And maybe just one point that I could end the talk with would be that we often think of sign languages as being very different from spoken languages, and that seems to lead to various semantic and syntactic stipulations about what sign languages do that's different. But I think we should start from a very simple assumption that we're doing exactly the same thing. Sign languages don't make indices more overt than spoken languages. They're as overt as in spoken languages, and so on.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, I think it's good time to finish this session, and yeah, it's time to go to and have dinner. And thank you for your wonderful talk. Yeah.